Reading from Srimad-Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 3, Text number 41. Tadidam grahyam asha tadidam grahyam asa sutam atmavatam varam sutam atmavatam varam sarva veda itihasanam sarva vedetihasanam saram saram samudritam saram saram samudritam tadidam grahyamasa sutam atmavatam varam sarva vedetihasanam saram saram samudritam. Sutam atmavatam varam sarva vedetihasanam saram saram samudritam tadidam grahyamasa atmavatam varam sarva vedetihasanam saram saram samudritam. Sarva vedetihasanam saram saram samudritam. Tad, that, idam, this, grahyamasa, made to accept, sutam, onto his son, atmavatam, of the self-realized, varam, most respectful, sarva, all, veda, Vedic literature, books of knowledge, itihasanam, of all the histories, saram, cream, saram, cream, samudritam, taken out. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Translation. Sri Vyasadeva delivered it to his son, who is the most respected among the self-realized, after extracting the cream of all Vedic literatures and histories of the universe. Please repeat this translation. Sri Vyasadeva delivered it to his son, who is the most respected among the self-realized, after extracting the cream of all Vedic literatures and histories of the universe. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. Men with a poor fund of knowledge only accept the history of the world from the time of Buddha, or since 600 BC, and prior to this period all histories mentioned in the scriptures are calculated by them to be only imaginary stories. That is not a fact. All the stories mentioned in the Puranas and Mahabharata etc. are actual histories, not only of this planet, but also of millions of other planets within the universe. Sometimes the history of the planets beyond this world appear to such men to be unbelievable, but they do not know that different planets are not equal in all respects, and therefore some of the historical facts derived from other planets do not correspond with the experience of this planet. Considering the different situation of different planets and also time and circumstances, there is nothing wonderful in the stories of the Puranas, nor are they imaginary. We should always remember the maxim that one man's food is another man's poison. We should not therefore reject the stories and histories of the Puranas as imaginary. The great rishis like Vyasa had no business putting some imaginary stories in their literatures. In the Srimad-Bhagavatam, historical facts selected from the histories of different planets have been depicted. It is therefore accepted by all the spiritual authorities as the Mahapurana. The special significance of these histories is that they are all concerned with the activities of the Lord in a different time and atmosphere. Srila Shukadev Goswami is the topmost personality of all self-realized souls, and he accepted this as the subject of studies from his father, Vyasadeva. Srila Vyasadeva is the great authority, and the subject matter of Srimad-Bhagavatam being so important, he delivered the message first to his great son, Srila Sukadeva Goswami. It is compared to the cream of the milk. Vedic literature is like the milk of ocean of knowledge, is the milk like the milk ocean of knowledge. Cream or butter is the most palatable essence of milk, and so also is the Srimad-Bhagavatam, for it contains all palatable, instructive, and authentic versions of different activities of the Lord and his devotees. There is no gain, however, in accepting the message of the Bhagavatam from the unbelievers, atheists, and professional reciters who make a trade of Bhagavatam for the layman. It was delivered to Srila Shukadev Goswami, and he had nothing to do with the Bhagavata business. He did not have to maintain family expenses by such trade. Srimad Bhagavatam should therefore be received from the representative of Shukadeva, who must be in the renounced order of life without family encumbrance. Milk is undoubtedly very good and nourishing, but when it is touched by the mouth of a snake, it is no longer nourishing. Rather, it becomes a source of death. Similarly, those who are not strictly in the Vaishnava discipline should not make a business of this Bhagavatam and become a cause of spiritual death for so many hearers. In the Bhagavad-gita, the Lord says that the purpose of all the Vedas is to know Him, Lord Krishna, and Srimad-Bhagavatam is Lord Sri Krishna Himself in the form of recorded knowledge. Therefore, it is the cream of all Vedas, and it contains all historical facts of all times in relation with Sri Krishna. It is factually the essence of all histories. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Jnananjanashalakayat Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Namo Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Preshtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschati Deshatarine Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So, Srimad-Bhagavatam is further continuing here. So, the situation here is that all the rishis have assembled in the forest of Naimisharanya, and they are headed by Shaunaka Rishi to perform a 1,000-year sacrifice in glorification of the Supreme Lord. And they are putting forward their questions to Suta Goswami. And Suta Goswami is the person who had previously heard the Bhagavatam, and the Bhagavatam was first spoken by Shukadev Goswami to Maharaj Parikshit. So he is the authorized person to speak the Bhagavatam to the sages of Naimisharanya. 88,000 sages had assembled in the forest of Naimisharanya, all of them headed by Shaunaka Rishi. And here Suta Goswami is explaining the Bhagavatam to them. And the sages headed by Shaunaka Rishi put forward 6 questions to Suta Goswami, and in answer to that 6 questions is the entire Srimad-Bhagavatam. And in this chapter particularly, Suta Goswami has glorified all the different incarnations of the Lord, beginning from Matsya, Kurma, Varaha, Narasimha, Prithu, and then Rishabhadeva, Buddha, Kapila. All 22 incarnations of the Supreme Lord are mentioned in Bhagavatam. 10 are very prominent, which we know as Dashavatara, but 22 in total, including Buddha, Prithu Maharaj, then all other incarnations are mentioned here. Then finally, after mentioning all these incarnations, Srimad-Bhagavatam concluded, Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam, that the Supreme Lord Krishna is the origin of all these different incarnations. And further, now, here in this verse and the verse previous to this, is the glorification of Bhagavatam itself. All these verses, the Bhagavatam was glorifying Krishna. Sutta Goswami was glorifying the Supreme Lord and his different incarnations. Now the last verse, 40th verse, and this verse is glorification of Bhagavatam itself. Glories of the scripture which is glorifying Krishna. So in the last verse it was mentioned, Idam Bhagavatam Nama Puranam Brahma Sammitam Uttama Shloka Charitam Chakara Bhagavan Rishihi. This great Bhagavatam is a literary incarnation of the Lord, and it is compiled by Vyasadeva. Chakara Bhagavan Rishihi. So here Bhagavan Rishihi refers to Vyasadeva, incarnation of the Lord. And Nishreyasa Yasya Lokasya, it is meant for the ultimate good of all people. Dhanyam Swasti Ayanam Mahat, and it is all successful, all blissful, and all perfect. So in this way, Sutta Goswami glorified Srimad-Bhagavatam itself. What is the glory of Bhagavatam? And in this verse, Sutta Goswami is further explaining about Bhagavatam. Tadidam grahyam asa sutam atmavatam varam. Atmavatam varam sutam. Sutam here refers to the son of Vyasadeva, and he is referred as Atmavatam varam. Atmavatam means self-realized. Atmavatam varam means the best among the self-realized, most respected person among the self-realized. Sarva Vede Itihasanam, it is the essence of all the Vedas and all the Itihasas. Saram Samudritam, Samudritam means taken out. So in this way, Bhagavatam is being glorified here, and Sutta Goswami is explaining that Shukadev Goswami is Atmavatam varam. He is the most respected among the self-realized. So in another place it is mentioned that there are 4 considerations for giving respect in the society. I think in one of the lectures Maharaj had mentioned this. The first consideration is age. If a person is elder to us, we offer respect. That is the first consideration. Second is the position held by the person. For example, in the Vedic culture, king is holding a particular position. So the king may be a young person, but an elderly person goes and offers his respect to the king because king is holding a particular position. So position surpasses age. Third is the learning of a person. If a Brahmana comes to the court of the king is holding a position, but because Brahmana is learned, king has to offer respect to the Brahmana. So first is age, second is position, third is learning. So position surpasses or supersedes age, and learning surpasses or supersedes position also. So first is age, then position, then learning. Then fourth, finally, it is a person's spiritual consciousness or his devotional consciousness to Krishna. That surpasses learning also. Person may be very learned, but if somebody is more advanced in Krishna consciousness, then he has to be given more respect than the person who is learned. So first is age, then position, then learning, then finally is the spiritual advancement. And that was followed in the case of Shukadev Goswami. Because Shukadev Goswami, when he walked into the assembly where all the sages and rishis and great personalities had assembled, because all of them got to know that Parikshit Maharaj has been cursed. In 7 days he is about to pass away, and he is now on the banks of the Ganges. He is looking for a solution. Then from all over the universe, great personalities had assembled in that place. So in that assembly, Shri Krishna, Rukmini, Satyabhama, Shri Krishna Balaram, Shri Gaurnita, Shri Lakshmi Narasimha. In that assembly, very great personalities were there. Great rishis were there. The great yogis were there. They had been doing tapasya for hundreds of years. So all end of Dwapara Yuga. So definitely they would have been alive for many more than 100 years. And great Parikshit Maharaj himself was there, great king. And definitely other powerful kings would have come. And many great learned Brahmanas had come. All these personalities were there. So in every respect, by age, by position, by learning, in every respect, all of these personalities were greater than Shukadev Goswami. Shukadev Goswami was only a 16-year-old boy. So in age, probably he was the youngest person. Everybody else were far more aged than him. He was not a king. And there were many great learned Brahmanas, philosophers, sannyasis, yogis, all had assembled there. But when Shukadev Goswami walked into that assembly, everyone stood up in respect without any consideration, because they could all understand the deep Krishna consciousness, the deep absorption in the transcendental loving service of Krishna, which Shukadev Goswami carried. So they could understand the consciousness of Shukadev Goswami. So in that way, it is established that a person's Krishna consciousness is given first priority when it comes to respect. All other things, learning, position, age, is subordinate to a person's devotional consciousness. So that is established in the life of Shukadev Goswami. So that way, Bhagavatam is glorifying Shukadev Goswami as Atmavatam Varam. He is the most respected among all the self-realized persons. Sutam, he is the son of Vyasadeva. And Vyasa had delivered this Bhagavatam to his son, which is Sarva Vedeti Hasanam. It is the cream of all Vedic literatures. Prabhupada mentions like that. Because Vedic literature is very, 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 very vast. Somewhere I had read that there are 1 crore verses in the Vedic literature. So you can imagine, 1 crore means 1 crore, 2 crore, 3 crore, 10 crore, 20 crore, 50 crore, 100 crore, 1000 crore, 25,000 crore, like that 1 crore verses are there. So it is very, 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 very vast, and there are varieties of subject matters in the Vedas to cater to different kinds of people. Because somebody is in Sattva Guna, somebody is in Tamo Guna, somebody is in Rajo Guna, somebody is a Jnani, somebody is a Yogi, somebody has some other tendency. All these personalities, they have to be engaged in the path of Dharma. So Vedic literatures are very vast, different instructions for different kinds of people. So if a person tries to study the Vedic literature, even after learning Sanskrit language, which itself takes 12 years to master, he will be thoroughly confused that what is the purpose of the Vedas, what is it that the Vedas are telling us. In one place Veda says something, another place it says something else, in one place it says go to the higher planetary system, another place it says do yoga, another place it says you worship some demigod, another place it says you do tapa, you do this, you do that. So different subject matters are talked about. So all these things is very confusing, and for a person to figure out the ultimate purpose of life by studying the Vedic literatures directly is close to impossible. So Vyasadeva has extracted the cream of all the Vedic literatures and put it in the Srimad-Bhagavatam. So Srimad-Bhagavatam is the most essential aspect of Vedic literatures. It contains all the knowledge which one can know from the Vedas, but it contains much more, that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and loving devotional service to Krishna is the ultimate purpose of the Vedas. It is the ultimate purpose of life. This is established in the Bhagavatam very nicely. So, Prabhupada elaborates these two things in the purport. So, in the first paragraph, Srila Prabhupada talks about the fact that the incidents mentioned in the Puranas and Itihasas are not imaginary, and Vyasadeva had no business putting imaginary stories in his magnum opus. So, for thousands of years in this country, at least for the last 5,000 years, since the Bhagavatam was composed, people would very faithfully hear the Bhagavatam, they would study the Bhagavatam, and practically every person in our country, whether he is literate or illiterate, he would know all the pastimes of the Lord in the Bhagavatam, whether it is Gajendra Moksham, or it is Ajamila, or it is Prahlada Charita, or Dhruva Charita. These are all very common knowledge. Now, when the Westerners first came to India, and many of them were very curious about Vedic literature, the first thing they did was to learn Sanskrit language. So there were many Brahmanas in India at that time, at least, if not qualified Brahmanas, at least Brahmanas by their family tradition or birth. So they also taught these British scholars Sanskrit. And many of them, when they learned Sanskrit language, the next thing they did was to try and study Ramayana, Mahabharata, and Bhagavatam, because these three literatures are very, very popular in our country, apart from the Upanishads and other things. So when they read, they were totally bewildered and confused by the kind of descriptions that are mentioned in the Ramayana. The Ravana is mentioned as, some huge, in his stature. Jatayu is mentioned as a huge bird. His brother Sampati could travel, almost touch the sun. These kind of descriptions were there in Bhagavatam also, Ramayana also. So when these scholars, when they read the Bhagavatam, they could not at all relate it with anything in the current world. Because that was the time a steam engine was being invented, there were efforts to invent electricity, and then there are attempts to, use telescopes and understand the astronomy of this universe. All these scientific developments were happening. At that time, if somebody told there is Gajendra Moksha, there is an elephant who was in the river for 1000 years, that elephant fought with the crocodile, and then finally when the elephant could not fight any longer, he called out in prayer to the Supreme Lord, and then Vishnu came with a chakra, and he cut off the crocodile's head. These things made no sense to them. So they dismissed all the Vedic literatures as imaginary and set up the education system, which is now we are all proudly following our English education system. So the direct result of this Macaulay or British education system was to dismiss all the descriptions in the Vedic literatures as imaginary. Now the reason these British scholars could not understand the Vedic literatures even after mastering Sanskrit language, many of them were very great Sanskrit scholars who came to India. The reason is Vedic literature cannot be understood by anybody other than one who is a qualified Brahmana. This is the most important point. Unless somebody is a qualified Brahmana, by his guna, by his character, he cannot understand the Vedic literature. And most of these British scholars who learned Sanskrit, they were all deeply influenced by the mode of passion and ignorance. They were influenced by Rajoguna and Tamoguna, probably no trace of Sattva-guna at all. So such persons with their heart full of lust, anger, greed, envy, illusion, with such a consciousness, when they read the Vedic literatures, particularly the pastimes of Krishna, what is this? Some kind of king was there, he was a prince, he used to steal the garments of women who were taking bath in the pond, and then he danced with some 16,000 women, and that person is glorified in this country. So they dismissed entire Indian culture or Vedic culture as a barbarian race, that these people are simply barbarians. This was the direct result. Because unless somebody is qualified as a Brahmana by performing devotional service to Krishna, removing the passion and ignorance from his heart, without that, prematurely jumping to the pastimes of the Lord in the Puranas and Itihasas will always produce a contrary result. And the first set of Indians who learned English language and who were influenced by Western thought at that time, they were also influenced by these British ideas. And they also dismissed Vedic literature as imaginary, and they dismissed the entire Vedic culture as imaginary. This was a result. In fact, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur was also educated in college exactly at that same time. Just at the time when the Britishers were introducing English education in all colleges and dismissing Vedic literatures as imaginary, at that time, by the great arrangement of Krishna, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur was also a very prominent college student. And it is at that time that Bhaktivinoda Thakur started explaining Krishna consciousness in English language for the benefit of the people in general. So it was because of the efforts of Bhaktivinoda Thakur at that time, initially, many people understood the deep import of Krishna consciousness. So this was a very significant contribution in the late 1870s, 1875, 76 at that time. That was the peak of the time when the first batch of Indians, having got graduated from the British universities, Bombay Presidency, Madras Presidency, Calcutta Presidency, come out of these colleges. That is the time they completely rejected Vedic literature as false and imaginary. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur's contribution at that point of time is very significant in bringing back the faith of many people into the Vedic literature. So Prabhupada mentions that the incidents mentioned in the Puranas and Itihasas are not imaginary. Why? Because Vyasadeva had no business putting imaginary stories in his magnum opus of the Srimad-Bhagavatam. So Vyasadeva is a very great philosopher. Generally, philosophers do not concern themselves with any imaginary stories. In the Western world, some philosophers are very much glorified. For example, Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, then Thomas Aquinas. They're all very great philosophers in the Western world. And their words are taken with great weight. Voltaire, Karl Marx, they're great philosophers. because their writings were all mostly in European languages, people could understand them. But the greatest philosopher in the entire world is Vyasadeva. But people were never able to appreciate him because Vyasadeva's language itself is beyond nobody can touch Vyasa's language. That kind of language Vyasa wrote. So, Vyasadeva, he is the greatest philosopher. Why he is considered the greatest philosopher? Because traditionally, in India, there are 6 systems of philosophy. 6 great philosophical conclusions exist in the Vedic society. And all those 6 philosophical conclusions are actually atheistic in nature, because they don't accept that Supreme Lord as the cause behind this material nature. Just like today scientists are trying to study nature, they want to figure out what is behind nature, but they do not know there is God. Similarly, in the Vedic times also, there were rishis, there were philosophers, there were great munis who would study this nature, Prakriti, in great detail, but they would come to a conclusion that Prakriti has no Ishvara in its background. So Vyasadeva has refuted all these philosophical systems in his Brahma Sutra. So that is Vyasadeva's greatest philosophical work. That is why across the world today, even in the Western countries, Brahma Sutra is held in great respect. Many people know. Because all these false philosophical ideas are refuted by Vyasadeva and Brahma Sutra. And Brahma Sutra, Vyasadeva has established that behind this Prakriti is Brahman. That much is explained in the Brahma Sutra. What is that Brahman? That Vyasadeva is explained in the Srimad-Bhagavatam. That Brahman is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna. That is explained by Vyasadeva in the Bhagavatam. That is why in the previous verse also, it is mentioned, Idam Bhagavatam Nama Puranam Brahma Samhitam. And Prabhupada translates the word Brahma Samhitam as incarnation of Lord Sri Krishna. So Vyasa established Brahman as the ultimate cause behind this Prakriti. But what is that Brahman? That Brahman is a personality. He is a person. He is a personality of Godhead Krishna. He has his form, name, qualities and activities. We can have a relationship with that Brahman who is the Supreme Lord Krishna. All that Vyasadeva is explained in the Srimad-Bhagavatam. So therefore, Srimad-Bhagavatam is the most important Vedic literature and is the cream of all Vedic literatures. By studying Srimad-Bhagavatam, one will know far more than what is mentioned in any of the Vedic literatures. So, Vyasadeva, who is such a great personality, who has written the greatest philosophical work, Brahma Sutra, so Prabhupada mentions, he has no business in writing imaginary stories in the Srimad-Bhagavatam. So, when Vyasadeva is mentioning about the Supreme Lord Krishna eating butter, stealing butter, and Gajendra Moksha, and Narasimha coming out of the pillar, it should be considered who is writing all these things. Why would the greatest philosopher, the person who has written the greatest philosophical work like Brahma Sutra, a person like Vyasadeva, why should he waste time in writing imaginary stories? So he had no business. So on the authority of Vyasadeva, Srila Prabhupada always established that whatever is mentioned in the Vedic literatures is authentic and true. That is why the spiritual master's appearance day is also called as Vyasa Puja, because he represents Vyasadeva. In other words, if somebody is not a representative of Vyasadeva, he cannot be a guru, he cannot be a spiritual master. So that's what Prabhupada mentions here, that many things which are mentioned in the Bhagavatam may not correspond with our experience, because Bhagavatam mentions histories of not only this planet, but thousands of other planets across the universe. And in different planets, the life conditions are different, the situation is different, the kind of experiences that one can have, that is also different. So many things are mentioned in the Bhagavatam, and many things mentioned in the Bhagavatam may not correspond with our experience. So, to explain this further, Srila Prabhupada often uses Kupa Manduka Nyaya. So even in the Vedic culture, this tendency is there among some rishis and philosophers, that if something does not correspond with their experience, they tend to reject it as imaginary. Even in those days, it used to happen. So therefore, in the Vedas, the warning is given with the example of Kupa Manduka Nyaya, frog in the well philosophy, a frog in the well logic, So, a frog, as Prabhupada mentions many times, who has never been to the ocean, he can never understand the position of the ocean by calculating the ocean in terms of the well in which the frog is staying. So, in that sense, another frog came and told him the ocean is huge. This other frog could never, ever understand. Similarly, Bhagavatam mentions so many things. There are huge planets. There's an ocean of sugarcane juice. There's an ocean of ghee. There's an ocean of milk. There's an ocean of so many different things. So people cannot imagine because they think that such things do not correspond with our experience. So therefore, it is to be understood that even if something does not correspond with our experience, one should not reject it because it is mentioned in the Vedic literature. So that is the first point Srila Prabhupada mentions. Second thing Prabhupada mentions is that the special significance of the histories mentioned in the Bhagavatam is that they are all concerned with the activities of the Lord. This is where the Bhagavatam, or in that sense the Puranas and Itihasas, they differ from mundane stories, fiction, novels out of which the movies are made. So people may say, okay, these are all some stories of some kings or some personalities. What is so great? So many stories are there, so many novels are there. But Prabhupada says, no. The special significance is that they are all concerned with the activities of the Supreme Lord. That person who is the cause of all causes, that person who is seated in the hearts of everyone as Paramatma, who is the controller of this entire material nature, the Supreme Lord, the person behind this creation, his activities are mentioned in the Ramayana, Mahabharata, Bhagavatam and other Puranas. And therefore, that is the significance of hearing all of them, that they are all connected with the Lord. Because the ultimate purpose of the Vedic literature is Smartavyo Satatam Vishnuhu Vismartavyo Najatuchit. Always remember Krishna and never forget Krishna. So therefore, all the histories, all the different stories, all the different incidents, historical incidents mentioned in the Bhagavatam, some way or the other they are connected with the Lord. Nothing is mentioned in the Vedic literature which has no connection with Krishna. So by hearing them, one becomes Krishna conscious. One develops remembrance of Krishna, which is the purpose of the Vedic literature, to somehow or the other induce the people to always remember Krishna. So that is the significance of Bhagavatam. Then further Prabhupada says that Srimad-Bhagavatam is the cream of all Vedic literature, and cream is the most essential part of milk. Therefore that analogy is used that we have already discussed. But lastly, Srila Prabhupada warns all of us, but there is no gain in accepting the Bhagavatam from unbelievers, atheists and professional reciters. Three categories of persons Srila Prabhupada is giving a warning. People who, unbelievers means actually a person may have no faith in what is mentioned in the Vedic literatures. And still he may be a scholar of the Vedas also. This point is highlighted very nicely in the story in Rajavidya, and Prabhupada mentions that story, the cobbler and Brahmana. So Narada Muni meets both of them, and both of them ask, when is my deliverance? When is the Lord going to take me back to Vaikuntha? So Narada says, I will go find out and come back. So he goes, he meets the Lord. So he asks the Lord, when is the Brahmana getting delivered? When is the cobbler getting delivered? So the Lord says, Brahmana I do not know, cobbler is coming back this life back to me. So Narada asks, why are you saying like this? The Brahmana is Chaturvedi, he has studied all the 4 Vedas. So Krishna said, yes, you will come to know why. So go and tell them. They will ask, what was the Lord doing in Vaikuntha? Go and tell them that the Lord was inserting elephants and camels into the eye of the needle. Go and tell them this, then you will come to know why the cobbler will come back and why the Brahmana will not come back. So Narada Muni goes back, and then he meets the Brahmana. The Brahmana asks, what is it that the Lord was doing in Vaikuntha? So he says, this is what the Lord was doing. He was inserting an elephant and a camel into the eye of a needle. Brahmana could not believe this, because he was a great logician. Tarka, Nyaya, all these things he was very expert in. So his intelligence could not accept that the Lord can do such an activity. So he outright rejected. He said, I don't believe all these things. So Narada understood why this Brahmana will not go back to God in this life. Then further he goes, he meets the cobbler, and then the cobbler also, Narada mentions the same thing. Immediately the cobbler burst out in tears with full appreciation for the Supreme Lord. And then further, Narada wants to test his faith. He is not ready to accept his expression of emotion. Narada wants to, what is the basis? I told that the Lord is inserting a camel and an elephant into the eye of a needle, and you have accepted. On what basis? So give some explanation. So then Narada, the cobbler says, they were standing under a banyan tree. See, this banyan tree is there, and banyan tree produces that fruit. You would have seen that fruit. And in the fruit, there are hundreds of small seeds. So the cobbler said, within this one seed, the Supreme Lord has placed this entire banyan tree. So this much capacity the Lord has. So why He cannot insert an elephant and a camel into the eye of a needle? So it may be beyond our imagination, but the Lord can do everything. So such people are called believers. So Prabhupada says there is no gain in accepting the Bhagavatam from unbelievers. So somebody is an unbeliever, but he is speaking Bhagavatam because Bhagavatam is also very good Sanskrit poetry. That is also a fact. So many people are attracted by the literary value of Srimad-Bhagavatam. There is no poetry like Srimad-Bhagavatam. So they like to read, they like to recite, they like to, it's all wonderful Sanskrit literature. So for the sake of Sanskrit literature also many people study the Bhagavatam. Like the Brahmana was a great Sanskrit scholar. But actually what is mentioned in that, they don't have faith. So that faith is very much necessary if one has to go back to Krishna. So they are called unbelievers. Then atheists, of course there are so many different types of atheists. And some of them, atheists also refers to impersonalists, because impersonalism is a hidden form of atheism. Like Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said, Prachannam Bauddham Uchyate. Buddhism directly says there is no soul, there is no God. Whereas impersonalism, indirectly it says there is God, but that God has no eyes, no legs, no hands, no mouth, no intelligence, no mind. Like this, there is a God. So it's a very subtle and indirect way of denying the existence of God. That is impersonalism. So in one sense, impersonalists are also atheists. So there are many impersonalists, even in Vrindavan, those who speak Bhagavatam, for whatever reasons they may want to do. So from such persons also, one should not hear the Bhagavatam. And finally, professional reciters. They may have some faith, they may not have some faith, but their motive of reciting the Bhagavatam is to make some livelihood out of the Srimad-Bhagavatam. Such persons also, one should not hear the Bhagavatam. Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur said, it is better to be a humble sweeper on the street and make one's livelihood rather than earn one's livelihood by reciting the Srimad-Bhagavatam. This statement of Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur. So like that, if one hears Bhagavatam from unbelievers, atheists and professional reciters, the result will be that whatever faith is there in their heart, that will get added on or rubbed on to the person who is hearing. Sound has so much power. All politicians know the power of sound. By using some powerful speech, you can motivate the general mass of people not to vote for this political party or create some agitation, create some movement. That's why in the modern society, orators have a lot of value, because they can use the power of sound and power of words to sway the people's emotion in a certain direction. So that power, even material sound has got. So whatever faith is there in the heart of the speaker, that same faith rubs on to the person who is hearing. So if somebody hears Bhagavatam from unbelievers, atheists and professional reciters, nowadays especially the social media, so much is available, the result will be, Prabhupada puts very beautifully, the result will be, become a cause of spiritual death for so many hearers. This is the way Srila Prabhupada writes. It will become a spiritual death. What is that spiritual death? That spiritual death is one will not develop love of Krishna and will not be able to go back to Godhead. This is that spiritual death. So therefore, one should be very careful, and the substantiated by milk touched by the lips of a serpent. So this is Sanatan Goswami's statement. Sarpa uchishtam yata payaha. Paya means milk. Sarpa uchishtam. If milk has been touched by the lips of a serpent, then one should not touch. So Bhagavatam, the glorification of the Supreme Lord from the mouth of unbelievers, atheists and professional reciters is compared to milk touched by the serpent's mouth by all our acharyas. So our acharyas have particularly warned against hearing Bhagavatam from such unscrupulous men. Sometimes it may be very tempting, because such persons are very, very, very expert speakers. They are very expert in the use of words, flowery words they can use, and present the Bhagavatam in a nice way for the entertainment of the audience. But the result is one's heart will not undergo the transformation for which the Bhagavatam was composed by Vyasadeva. So therefore, one should avoid all these things. And in other words, one should hear Srimad-Bhagavatam from a pure devotee like Srila Prabhupada. And by doing so, one will also develop the same kind of consciousness which Prabhupada is having. And as a result of this, one can go back home, back to Godhead, Krishna. So in this way, we should avoid hearing Bhagavatam from unscrupulous persons. So with these few words we will stop today. Grantaraj Srimad-Bhagavatam ki, Jagat Guru Srila Prabhupada ki, Nitai Gaur Shagande, Hari Hari Bol.